In the pre-dawn hours of April 25, 1977, the desolate expanse of Pampa Luma near Putre in Chile lay shrouded in an almost tangible silence. The vast highland plateau, with its undulating terrains and sparse vegetation, was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glimmers of starlight piercing the clear Andean sky. A biting chill permeated the air, a stark reminder of the altitude and the isolation of this remote region. Nestled against a weathered stone wall, a small military patrol huddled around a modest campfire. The soldiers, clad in their standard-issue uniforms, engaged in subdued conversation, their breath visible in the cold night air. Occasionally, a muted chuckle would break the monotony. Corporal Armando Valdez, the patrol leader, sat slightly apart from his men, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His face, clean-shaven and stern, reflected the weight of responsibility. The routine nature of their assignment did little to alleviate the unease that often accompanied such patrols in the isolated wilderness. Suddenly, the stillness was disrupted. Private Rosales, one of the sentries positioned a few meters away, approached with hurried steps, his face pale and eyes wide with apprehension. He gestured emphatically towards a distant point in the darkness, his voice trembling as he reported the sighting of two luminous violet objects descending from the sky. The men turned their attention to the direction indicated, and there, piercing the inky blackness, were two radiant lights. One remained stationary, casting an eerie glow over the terrain, while the other advanced steadily towards them, its brilliance intensifying with each passing moment. Corporal Valdez, sensing the growing trepidation among his men, took decisive action. He ordered the immediate extinguishing of the campfire, the primary source of their warmth and comfort. The flames were swiftly smothered, plunging the group into near-total darkness, save for the encroaching luminescence. As the violet light drew nearer, its intensity illuminated the soldiers' faces, revealing expressions of awe and dread. The air grew colder, and an uncanny stillness enveloped the scene. The men clutched their weapons tighter, their eyes fixed on the approaching anomaly. Then, without warning, the light halted its advance, hovering silently a short distance away. The patrol stood frozen, hearts pounding, as they awaited the next move of this enigmatic presence. What transpired next would forever alter their understanding of time and reality, plunging them into a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The violet light hovered just ahead, its unnatural glow pulsing in slow, hypnotic waves. Corporal Armando Valdez took a measured step forward, then another. His breath, visible in the biting cold, came in short, shallow gasps. All his instinct told him to stop, to turn back. But something deeper, something unexplainable, pushed him on. A sound, low and indistinct, began to rise, not from the sky nor the earth, but from somewhere in between. It was a whisper, layered upon itself, growing in intensity until it became a chorus of voices speaking in a language beyond comprehension. The men behind Valdez gripped their weapons tighter, their hands clammy despite the frigid air. The light swelled suddenly, an explosion of brilliance that obliterated the landscape. The soldiers recoiled, shielding their eyes. And when the radiance dimmed, Valdez was gone. A sharp gasp cut through the group. The men exchanged frantic glances. He had been right there, only feet away. Then, nothing. No sound, no movement, no trace. It was as though the night had swallowed him whole. Over 15 minutes passed. The air hung heavy, still charged with the static hum of something unnatural. Then, from the darkness, movement. A figure staggered forward, emerging from the unseen void beyond the light. It was Valdez. He stumbled, his body trembling as though he had been gripped by an unseen force. His breath came in ragged bursts, his eyes wide and unfocused. The men froze, their terror mounting as he fell to his knees. His once clean-shaven face was now covered in thick, dark stubble, days' worth of growth in a matter of minutes. His uniform, stiff with cold, seemed unchanged, but something about him, something in his expression, was different. One of the men rushed forward, gripping Valdez by the shoulders. "Corporal, what happened? Where did you go?" Valdez's lips parted, but the words that came forth sent a shudder through every man present.
"You do not know who we are, nor where we come from, but we will return."
His voice was low, distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Then, as if the effort had drained him completely, he collapsed into unconsciousness. The men were paralyzed, unable to process what they had just witnessed. One of them, hands shaking, reached for Valdez's wrist to check his pulse. He made a startling discovery. His watch. The time was wrong. It had stopped at 4:30 a.m. when he had vanished. But the date, it had jumped forward to 5 days ahead. The realization sent a ripple of unease through the group. Valdez had been gone for mere minutes, but his body, his face, his watch, all bore evidence that he had lived through something far longer. They lifted him, carrying him back to camp, all the while keeping their eyes on the sky, on the place where the light had been. It was gone now, vanished as silently as it had appeared. But the soldiers knew. Something had been here, and it had taken Valdez. The following hours were a haze. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering phrases none of them could understand. He awoke only once before sunrise, his eyes darting wildly as though he was still lost in that otherworldly glow. But when they asked him what had happened, what he had seen, he said nothing. Morning came. The light of day washed over the barren plateau, and yet the feeling of something unseen watching from the shadows lingered. The soldiers packed their camp in silence, eager to leave the place where the impossible had unfolded before their very eyes. As they marched back towards civilization, one thought haunted them all. Where had Valdez gone? And more terrifying still, had something followed him back? The case of Corporal Armando Valdez remains one of the most chilling examples of time anomalies and unexplained disappearances. His vanishing and reappearance, marked by an impossible 5-day time shift, mirrored countless other cases of individuals who seemed to slip between the cracks of reality, only to return altered, if they returned at all. But while Valdez came back alive, bewildered and forever haunted by his experience, others were not so fortunate. One such case, buried deep within classified military reports, occurred nearly 2 decades earlier in the vast, desolate expanse of White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. Unlike Valdez, Sergeant Jonathan P. Levette never had the chance to speak of what happened to him. His story hints at something even darker, an encounter not just with a phenomenon, but with something or someone watching from the other side. The year was 1956, and the wind howled through the barren expanse of the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The desert stretched for miles, an endless sea of dust and rock bathed in the pale light of an unforgiving sun. The military testing site, a place of secrecy and classified operations, was eerily silent save for the occasional distant thud of experimental ordnance. Two men moved carefully across the sandy terrain, Major William Cunningham and Sergeant Jonathan P. Levette, both seasoned servicemen of the U.S. Air Force. They were miles from the nearest installation, tasked with recovering debris from a test missile launch that had scattered across the landscape. As they searched, Levette strayed ahead, descending into a small ravine where remnants of twisted metal glinted in the harsh light. Cunningham, brushing dust off his uniform, looked up just in time to see Levette freeze in place, his body rigid, his head tilting upward towards something unseen. Without warning, he let out a loud scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, not yet. It was a sound of sheer terror, the kind that sent ice coursing through Cunningham's veins. He ran forward, his boots kicking up dry earth. And then he stopped. There, in the ravine below, something was moving. At first, Cunningham could barely comprehend what he was seeing. A long metallic structure, not quite a craft, not quite anything familiar, hovered silently just above the ground. It had no visible seams, no markings, no propulsion system. It simply hung there, motionless. Something else started to emerge. Cunningham could hardly believe his eyes as multiple figures appeared. They were not human, tall, thin, their limbs unnaturally elongated. Their skin was pale, almost translucent under the desert sun. No eyes, no mouths. And yet, he felt them watching him. Levette was no longer screaming. His voice had gone hoarse. He clawed at the air, his boots dragging against the earth as he was pulled, not by hands, but by something unseen, toward the metallic structure. Cunningham reached for his sidearm, but his fingers wouldn't move. His entire body felt paralyzed, locked in place by an unseen force. He could only watch as Levette's flailing form was dragged upward, toward the impossible. Then, a flash, brighter than the sun. A burst of white light that obliterated the entire scene in an instant. Moments later, nothing. Silence. When Cunningham's vision cleared, Levette was gone. The craft and figures had gone. The only sound was the wind whistling across the empty landscape. Cunningham stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned toward the base, his mind unable to process what had just transpired. It took him hours to reach his superiors. His words tumbled from his lips, incoherent at first, before he managed to relay the impossible. A search was launched. They combed the desert for days. Nothing was found, no tracks, no signs of struggle, not a single trace of Levette. 3 days later, they found him, 20 miles away. But his body was not intact. The medical team went pale at the sight. His corpse had been mutilated with a precision beyond human capability. Even more disturbingly, his body showed no signs of decomposition, as if, somehow, he had been dead for only a few hours. The base was thrown into chaos. Orders came down from the top ranks. The case was classified. The official report, exposure to the elements. But Cunningham knew the truth. The disappearance and horrific reappearance of Sergeant Jonathan P. Levette left a chilling mark on military history. An encounter with the unknown. But Levette's case was not unique. Across time and borders, others would experience the same eerie phenomenon. Half a world away, in the quiet forests of Scotland, another man would step forward into something beyond comprehension. Unlike Levette, he would live to tell his story. But he too would be left with questions that had no answers. This is the strange case of Robert Taylor. The air was crisp, the early morning frost still clinging to the grass as Taylor, a forestry worker, drove his truck along the winding back roads near Livingston, Scotland. The sky was a dull grey, heavy with the weight of an impending storm. It was November 9th, 1979, a day that would forever change his life. Taylor pulled his truck to a stop at the edge of the Detchmont woods, stepping out into the silent expanse. His breath curled in the cold air as he adjusted his jacket and started down the familiar path. He had walked this route countless times, yet something about the morning felt strange. The usual sounds of the forest were missing. No birds singing, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on his arms rise beneath his sleeves. It was quiet, too quiet, until he saw it. A huge metallic sphere hovered just ahead of him, its surface dark and smooth, almost absorbing the grey light around it. It wasn't just floating. It was silent, completely motionless, like it had been waiting there for him. Taylor froze. His legs refused to move. Before he could react, from beneath the object, two smaller spheres detached, rolling towards him on spindly metallic legs. The air felt electric, charged with something unseen but undeniable. The ground beneath him vibrated as the objects lurched forward. Suddenly, a searing force gripped his body. An invisible pressure clamped around his chest, squeezing, pulling, dragging him toward the towering craft. His vision blurred, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, but the sound never came. Darkness appeared. The world spun, followed by a crushing, suffocating silence, and eventually, an impact. He was on the ground, dirt pressed against his cheek. His limbs were heavy, his mind fogged. It felt like only seconds had passed, but as he sat up, gasping, he realized something was wrong. His clothes were torn, his trousers ripped at the seams, his head was throbbing, and his hands trembling. The object was gone. The woods around him were still eerily silent, but something was missing. Time. A deep, unsettling sensation gnawed at his mind. He had been gone longer than he thought. How long had he been away? The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the world had shifted while he was unconscious. Taylor staggered to his feet, his breath ragged as he stumbled toward his truck. All he knew was that something had taken him, and whatever it was, it had let him go. As Robert Taylor drove away from his encounter, he, like Sergeant Levette before him, found himself caught between the real world and something utterly indefinable. A place where time lost meaning, where the body bore physical proof of an experience science could not explain. And yet, few cases hold the same eerie layer of lost time, cryptic messages, and an unshaken witness account as the story of Corporal Armando Valdez. Unlike Levette, he came back. Unlike Taylor, he was not alone. His comrades saw it all, and they too were left to question what they had witnessed. Was this an encounter with something beyond human understanding, or was there another explanation? One of the most common skeptical arguments is that Valdez and his men succumbed to a form of mass hysteria or psychological disorientation. The harsh environment of Pampa Luma, the stress of military service, and the eerie isolation of the desert night could have triggered hallucinations, memory distortions, or even a fugue state in Valdez himself. The mind, under extreme stress, is capable of fabricating vivid hallucinations and altered time perception. Valdez's cryptic statement upon his return, "You do not know who we are, nor where we come from," but we will return soon. Could have been influenced by dreams, subconscious fears, or even pre-existing UFO lore that he had encountered before the event. Yet mass hysteria rarely results in measurable, physical anomalies. Valdez's sudden beard growth and the inexplicable advancement of his watch remain physical details that resist rational explanation. The entire patrol witnessed the glowing objects before Valdez approached. Were they all hallucinating the same thing? Some researchers propose that the strange encounter at Pampa Luma may have been the result of an experimental technology test, potentially involving classified aircraft, electromagnetic fields, or even chemical exposure. Military testing zones often have secret experiments underway, particularly during the Cold War era. If Valdez and his men were inadvertently exposed to an energy field or neurological weapon, it could explain temporary disorientation, lost time perception, and even physical effects like hair growth abnormalities. But if this were merely an experimental aircraft or electromagnetic disturbance, why didn't the military debrief or suppress the story? If it was a secret test, the government would have likely silenced Valdez rather than allowing him to speak about the experience for decades. Would such a test explain the eerie whispers heard by the soldiers before Valdez disappeared? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that Valdez's case was a genuine anomalous UFO encounter, similar to well-documented cases of missing time, bodily alterations, and cryptic aftereffects reported by abductees worldwide. Classic abduction stories have been widely sensationalized, and the 1970s saw a surge in UFO culture, potentially influencing accounts like this. The lack of physical evidence beyond witness testimony and Valdez's personal experience makes the UFO theory difficult to prove. Although, unlike most alleged UFO abduction cases, there were corroborating witnesses. Military personnel saw him disappear. They saw the light, they saw him reappear, and they saw the physical changes that should not have been possible. The time anomaly mirrors other well-documented cases where abductees claim to have lost entire periods with no recollection. If this was merely psychological or military-induced, why did it leave behind something seemingly beyond the laws of biology and physics? For Corporal Armando Valdez and his men, that night in 1977 was not just a strange occurrence, it was a fracture in their understanding of reality itself. Whatever happened in those missing minutes left its mark not only on Valdez, but on every single man present. Skeptics may offer logical explanations, but the questions remain unanswered. How did his beard grow in minutes, not days? How did his watch inexplicably move 5 days into the future? How did an entire squadron witness their leader disappear and return different? As with so many cases before it, Levette, Taylor, and countless others, what happened to Valdez may never be fully explained. What we do know is this: it's possible that something is out there, watching, waiting, and if Valdez's last words hold any truth, one day, it may return.